Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are diving deep into a singular career, one that is less a steady path and more a series of magnificent explosions, a timeline defined by soaring success, spectacular collapse, and just relentless entrepreneurial reinvention. We're talking about the life and work of filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola.
And our listener, the learner, is keen on understanding the complex genius behind the iconic films. The mission here is to look beyond the undisputed masterpieces, beyond the Godfather and Apocalypse Now. We are tracing the trajectory of a relentless risk-taker and serial entrepreneur who figured out how to use the profits from a massive commercial empire. And we're talking wineries, resorts, pasta sauces, to fund his ultimate, deeply personal, and often hugely expensive independent passion projects.
Like the upcoming epic Megalopolis?
Exactly. We're tracking his career from his absolute earliest days hustling in low-budget skin flicks right up to his current phase as a self-funded visionary.
The arc of his life is so dramatic, it often feels more like the plot of one of his own operatic films. And the surprising element is that this whole journey begins not with a clapboard and a camera, but with fragility and confinement.
It really is a story rooted in surprising humility. Francis Ford Coppola was born in Detroit, Michigan in 1939. And here's a detail that immediately anchors him in the American industrial landscape. His middle name, Ford.
That wasn't a coincidence, was it?
Not at all. It wasn't just a random name. It was inspired by the Henry Ford Hospital where he was born and the Ford Sunday Evening Hour radio show. That show was sponsored by the Ford Motor Company, where his father, Carmine Coppola, who was a talented flautist and composer, actually worked as an arranger and assistant orchestra director.
So from day one, his life is steeped in these two competing worlds. You have the high culture of classical music, thanks to his father, and then you have the mechanical industrial behemoth of American manufacturing. It's kind of the perfect setup for a career that would later merge grand artistic vision with meticulous engineering.
It is. And that journey took a crucial and pretty brutal early detour. When he was just a boy, he contracted polio.
Oh, wow.
And this resulted in long periods of being confined and bedridden. This physical isolation, which could have been crippling for another kid, actually became the crucible of his imagination. He couldn't go out and play with other children, so he began creating entire worlds indoors.
So this is where the director's instinct comes from.
This is exactly it. It started primarily through homemade puppet theater productions.
The desire to control and manipulate a miniature world of characters and events, that's the ultimate genesis of a director, isn't it?
Exactly. The source material notes he also began creating 8mm feature films. He would usually edit them from his family's home movies, and he'd give them these incredibly dramatic titles like The Rich Millionaire and The Lost Wallet.
Huh.
Even then, you can hear the beginnings of the operatic scale he would later apply to the Corleones in those early titles. Absolutely. And this fascination with the mechanics of creation, particularly the technology side of it, earned him the nickname Science as a child. Which is funny because he was apparently a rather mediocre student otherwise.
The science nickname is great because it shows his technical engineering side was always there, sort of competing with the artistic side. He initially trained for music, right? I read he played the tuba and even earned a scholarship.
He was definitely on the music track for a while. He got a tuba scholarship to the New York Military Academy, and then in 1955 he enrolled at Hofstra University, but by then he had decided he was going to chart his own course. He majored in theater arts, a decision that directly opposed his father's strong desire for him to go and study engineering.
It's that classic conflict, the practical father versus the artistic son.
A tale as old as time. And the moment that truly pivoted him away from the stage and into the cinema workshop sounds incredibly specific. It was a single, old, silent film, and it was all about the editing.
What was the film?
It was Sir Eisenstein's 1928 film, October, 10 Days That Shook the World. For Coppola, it was a visual and structural revelation. He was just profoundly impressed by the sheer mastery of the editing. That visual influence, the power of montage, is what cemented his decision to dedicate himself to cinema over traditional theater. He saw the power in it.
And he didn't waste any time applying that drive at Hofstra. That new production every week schedule mentioned in the sources sounds completely exhausting.
It was an incredible pace that really honed his craft. He was elected president of the university's drama group and its musical comedy club. And what does he do? He immediately merges them into a single entity, the Spectrum Players.
Of course he does.
And under his leadership, this single group staged a new production every single week. He was basically operating a professional factory while he was still a student. It was laying the groundwork for the high-pressure, high-output environments he would later manage on his film sets.
He also founded the Cinema Workshop, which shows that early drive to build infrastructure alongside just creating things. He wanted to build the whole system.
He did. And his prolific output earned him 3 D.H. Lawrence Awards for theatrical production and direction. That manic, relentless pace of production is precisely what prepared him for the intensity of the new Hollywood era. But then, post-UCLA Film School, after getting his MFA in 1967, the reality check was brutal. He had the degree, but he had no money.
Right, the hustle of the early 60s. This is a real grind for him.
A true grind. Initially, he was earning just $10 per week, which, even if you adjust for inflation to about $103 today, is clearly not a living wage.
No, not even close.
So this financial necessity forced him immediately into low-budget and, let's say, sometimes questionable genres. To put food on the table, he was writing and re-editing these short comedy films known as nudie cuties.
So, wait, what exactly were nudie cuties?
They were these short films that showed nudity, but they were careful to avoid any explicit sexual acts. Sort of a loophole genre at the time.
So he was working at the absolute fringe of cinema, just trying to cobble together a paycheck.
Precisely. His first solo script in this genre was The Peeper, a short comedy about a voyeur. He even hired a Playboy bunny, Marley Renfro, for it. But here's the interesting paradox. Even when he's making low-budget softcore, Coppola can't turn off his artistic impulse. His attempt to add what were described as cartoonish aspects to The Peeper actually alienated potential buyers.
He was too much of an auteur, even for the skinflix market. That's amazing.
It really is. They found it too stylized and not, quote, exciting enough to screen in adult theaters. It speaks volumes about his persistent, almost defiant vision. That film was so unsuccessful commercially that it had to be combined with another shelved erotic western to create the 1962 softcore comedy, Tonight for Sure.
He was literally working as a cinematic scavenger.
Absolutely. He was splicing together disparate projects just to earn a few $100s. He also re-edited a German film, Mit Eva Fin die Sünderin. He added his own footage, brought in some British models, and released it as The Bellboy and the Playgirls. He was learning every trick of the trade just to survive.
This sounds like the perfect apprenticeship for the ultimate independent producer, Roger Corman.
It was. Corman's operation was the definitive university for young, hungry directors, and Coppola certainly entered the program. He was hired as Corman's assistant, and his duties were often just surreal. His first major task was to dub and re-edit a Soviet sci-fi film, Nebo Zovyot.
And what did he turn it into?
Coppola transformed it. He added new scenes, violence, and sex, and released it as the monster movie Battle Beyond the Sun in 1962. Corman was apparently very impressed by his resourcefulness and speed.
Corman must have seen that essential scrappiness in him, that willingness to do whatever it takes.
He did, and Corman soon convinced Coppola to use some leftover funds from a previous production to make his first feature film. And that, of course, was Dementia 13.
A low-budget horror flick written in one night, filmed in 9 days. The Corman Special.
Yes, Dementia 13 from 1963. Coppola wrote a draft that incorporated elements of Hitchcock's Psycho in a single night. It was shot in just 9 days on a shoestring budget of $40,000. That film recouped its expenses, and critically, it was during this rapid high-pressure shoot that he met Eleanor Jessie Neal,
His future wife.
who he would marry and who would, years later, document the monumental chaos of his most ambitious film. The hustle of those early 60s, driven entirely by financial necessity, gave him his professional start, his artistic muscle, and his life partner.
And the irony is that the moment he stabilized financially, he immediately tried to challenge the established system. By 1969, he had won the Samuel Goldwyn Award for screenwriting, and he co-founded American Zoetrope in a San Francisco warehouse.
That founding is so crucial to understanding the next decade. Zoetrope was built on the idea of being a deviant studio.
A deviant studio? What did that actually mean in the new Hollywood era?
It meant creating an alternative infrastructure, a place run by filmmakers, for filmmakers, dedicated to challenging the industrial model. They wanted complete auteur control, they wanted to experiment, and they wanted a complete bypass of the risk-averse, bureaucratic Hollywood studios.
That rebellious spirit, that seeking of complete control, really set the stage for the most famous and most stressful decade of his career.
The 1970s represent a run of artistic genius that is almost unparalleled in cinema history. But the genius was born out of conflict and desperation, starting with a film he was almost fired from, Patton.
He co-wrote the script for Patton in 1970, starting way back in 1963, and that won him his first Academy Award for Best Original Screenplay. But the sources note there was huge resistance to his vision for it.
Absolutely. Coppola's script was considered far too stylized for a traditional war epic, and the studio shelved it. He was effectively fired. The specific point of contention was that bizarre, brilliant opening scene. The speech. General Patton giving a fierce, intense military pep talk against that massive looming American flag. The studio wanted a more straightforward, conventional opening.
Why did the studio consider that stylized introduction so risky? What were they afraid of?
Because it was deeply psychological. It was immediately asking the audience to question the nature of heroism, nationalism, and performance. It wasn't just introducing the character in a combat scenario. It was theatrical and it was non-traditional, and that scared them.
So what saved the script?
The star, George C. Scott. He remembered reading Coppola's version years earlier.
And he insisted on it.
He insisted. He said he would only take the title role if Coppola's stylized script was used. That saved Coppola's version. Though he still had to make some compromises, like replacing the word fucking with the slightly less vulgar fornicating to avoid an immediate R rating.
But that opening monologue became iconic, and it delivered Coppola his first Oscar.
It did. And that Oscar-winning momentum leads us directly to the saga that both saved his deviant studio and nearly destroyed him, The Godfather. And it's often forgotten that Coppola initially turned the film down.
Multiple times, right?
Multiple times. He found Mario Puzo's novel sleazy and sensationalist. He called it pretty cheap stuff. The only reason he took the job was the threat of financial ruin. And this is a critical point for you, the learner. The Godfather was an obligation, not a passion project, at the start.
What was the specific pressure he was under? Why was he so desperate?
American Zoetrope owed Warner Bros. A monumental amount of money, over $400,000. It was for massive budget overruns on George Lucas's first feature, THX 11138, which Coppola had produced.
So he was on the hook for Lucas's film.
Deeply. Coppola was desperate. He signed on for The Godfather in September 1970, agreeing to a relatively modest salary of $125,000 plus 6% of the gross rentals. And he did it purely to settle his debts and keep Zoetrope afloat.
And the production was immediately a fight for survival, where he was constantly on the verge of getting fired.
Constantly. He later admitted that while making it, the film was very unappreciated. Paramount, the studio, didn't like his measured, almost painterly style of shooting, and they actively hated his casting choices.
Especially Marlon Brando for Vito Corleone.
Oh, they despised it. They wanted a known quantity like Ernest Borgnine or, bizarrely, the TV star Danny Thomas.
Wait, so the studio only allowed Brando to be cast if he put up a financial bond? That's an insane level of professional distrust. How common was that level of humiliation for a star of his caliber?
It was almost unheard of. For an actor of Brando's stature, especially one who had basically defined the previous generation of acting, to be subjected to such punitive terms, it was shocking. Paramount forced him to agree to 3 highly restrictive conditions.
What were they?
First, accepting much less money than his previous films. Second, performing a screen test, which was highly demeaning for him. And third, putting up a bond guaranteeing he would not cause any delays in production, as he was notorious for doing on other sets.
So how did Coppola win that fight?
It came down to the screen test. Brando did it, and he was mesmerizing. Coppola won the battle, but it shows the degree to which he had to fight the system just to realize his vision.
The ultimate success, then, wasn't just artistic. It was an act of pure tenacity against the corporate machine, and that elevation of the material secured its legacy.
It did. Coppola transcended the genre. He found a much deeper theme in Puzo's novel. He shifted the material from just a sensational crime novel to a family saga and, significantly, a metaphor for capitalism in America.
Let's unpack that for a moment. How does the Corleone family operate as a capitalist metaphor rather than just a group of gangsters?
Well, if you look closely, the Corleone organization functions exactly like a ruthless vertical corporation. They deal in debt people, owe them favors, which are then leveraged for future gain. That's capital. They engage in market expansion, moving into Nevada and ultimately trying to go legitimate. Their succession plan is focused on finding the most ruthlessly efficient leader, who turns out to be Michael, to protect the firm's assets.
And the violence.
The violence is simply a highly effective, though illegal, mechanism for dealing with hostile takeovers, contract disputes, and maintaining market share. It's an American success story, just one that's operating outside the letter of the law.
That makes perfect sense. The critical reaction certainly reflected this elevation.
Absolutely. The great critic Pauline Kael wrote that while the Puzo's novel was trash, Coppola had lent the narrative true dignity. She praised his tenaciously intelligent direction and the film's heroic scale. The results were immediate. The Godfather set box office records, it won Best Picture, and it earned Coppola and Puzo the Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay. It was instantly hailed as a masterpiece.
And just 2 years later, he pulls off a hat trick that is arguably unmatched in cinematic history. He releases 2 masterpieces, one of which is a sequel, in the same year. Let's start with the smaller, more paranoid film, The Conversation.
The Conversation, 1974, further cemented his reputation as an auteur concerned with complex psychological themes. It was heavily influenced by Michelangelo Antonioni's 1966 film Blow Up. But what made it a major cultural touchstone was this chilling, uncanny timing.
The Watergate coincidence.
Precisely. The film featured surveillance and wiretapping equipment that was highly similar to what the Nixon administration used in the Watergate scandal, which was dominating headlines at the time.
So audiences interpreted it as a searing political commentary on what was happening right then.
Right. And Coppola maintained that the script had been completed way back in the mid-1960s, long before Watergate was even a thing. But the film's relevance was terrifyingly immediate. It tapped into the zeitgeist of paranoia and government overreach, and consequently, it won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1974. To have a Palme d'Or winner and a film that would go on to win Best Picture release simultaneously is it's staggering productive genius.
And that Best Picture winner was The Godfather Part 2. Making sequels wasn't a standard numbered Hollywood business model yet. This was a massive commercial and structural risk.
It was a huge gamble. Coppola was influenced by the epic 2-part structure of Sergei Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, and he decided to create a film that was simultaneously a prequel, showing the rise of young Vito Corleone, played by De Niro,
and a sequel showing the decay and spiritual fall of Michael Corleone with Pacino.
Exactly. And he claims Part 2 was the first major motion picture to use Part 2 in its title. Paramount was horrified. They were afraid that audiences would think they were just seeing leftover footage and would avoid the theaters.
But instead, it became the benchmark for all sequels that followed.
And critically, many deemed it superior to the original. Pauline Kael described the film as thematically richer, more shadowed, more full. It won 6 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director for Coppola, and Best Adapted Screenplay. And crucially, Robert De Niro's win for Best Supporting Actor made him and Brando the only actors to win Oscars for playing the same character. By 1974, Coppola was arguably the most creatively powerful director on the planet.
So if 1974 was the peak of his power, that leads directly to the sheer, agonizing scale of his next mega risk, Apocalypse Now.
The epic that defined the high cost of unchecked ambition, Apocalypse Now, 1979, was an adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness reset during the Vietnam War. The production in the Philippines was notoriously lengthy. It took 238 days of shooting and incredibly strenuous. It quickly earned the nickname Apocalypse When among the crew.
The anecdotes from that set are just the stuff of legend. You can feel the chaos just reading the source material.
The sheer physical and psychological toll was immense. They faced typhoons that destroyed massive, expensive sets. Martin Sheen suffered a serious heart attack mid-shoot.
He was only in his 30s.
Yeah. And the lead actor, Marlon Brando, arrived significantly overweight and completely unprepared, forcing massive script rewrites. And in perhaps the most surreal twist, the Philippine military extras, along with the helicopters they supplied, would frequently leave in the middle of scenes to go fight actual rebels in the jungle.
You can't make that up. It sounds like the production itself mirrored the madness of the war the film was depicting.
It absolutely did. That's why Coppola's famous quote from that era remains so resonant. He said, "We were in the jungle, there were too many of us, we had access to too much money, too much equipment, and little by little we went insane." He was documenting his own descent into creative madness while trying to capture the madness of war.
Despite all of that, or maybe because of that agony, the film was a massive creative achievement, particularly in sound design.
It was revolutionary. It shared the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1979, making Coppola one of only 10 filmmakers to win the award twice. But technically, it pushed so many boundaries. Walter Murch was the first person ever to receive a screen credit as a sound designer for his groundbreaking work on the film. He created that immersive, terrifying sonic landscape that makes you feel physically present in the war zone.
Roger Ebert's contemporary review is an excellent connection point here. He argued that the film achieves greatness because it expresses the agony and joy of making cinema. It sounds like Coppola took all his lessons from the 60s hustling and the 70s fighting and put all that energy into one giant, terrifying work that almost consumed him entirely.
I think that's right. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the 1970s proved that Coppola's vision was strong enough to create masterpieces. But the way he chose to produce them independently, with massive creative control and often facing off against studios, was financially unsustainable. The cost of that creative freedom would soon demand a catastrophic payment.
The source material clearly states that Apocalypse Now marked the end of Coppola's golden phase. The transition into the 1980s was instantaneous and utterly brutal, and it was largely defined by one colossal box office flop, One from the Heart.
The film, often referred to as the $26 million mistake,
Yeah.
One from the Heart, from 1982, was an incredibly ambitious Las Vegas set musical fantasy. Coppola used it to pioneer new techniques, particularly in video editing, pushing the boundaries of what was possible in post-production in the early 80s. He was trying to implement the efficiency and control he'd always sought, but this time using technology.
But the audience simply didn't respond. How disastrous were the numbers?
Catastrophically disastrous. Against its $26 million budget, which was huge for an independent fantasy musical at the time, it only grossed $636,000 domestically.
Oh, that's a wipeout.
A complete wipeout. And that failure created a financial chasm that Coppola would spend the entire decade trying to fill. The immediate consequence, a year later, was that he was forced to sell the sprawling 23-acre Zoetrope studio in 1983. He then spent the rest of the 80s working non-stop, taking on any project he could to pay off the immense debts accumulated from this single, ill-fated passion project.
That's a staggering fall. The master of control loses the independent infrastructure he built because of a technical experiment.
It is. And the need for immediate, stable income dominated his early 80s strategy. He found a surprisingly lucrative path by adapting S.E. Hinton novels, inspired by suggestions from middle school students who were devoted to the source material. This resulted in The Outsiders in 1983.
The Outsiders was a commercially successful launchpad for an insane amount of young talent.
The cast list is a who's who of 80s and 90s stardom. You've got Matt Dillon, Ralph Macchio, Patrick Swayze, Tom Cruise, Rob Lowe, and Emilio Estevez.
The Brat Pack.
Basically, the founding members. It was a decent commercial success, grossing about $25.7 million against a $10 million budget, and he kept it a family affair. His father, Carmine Coppola, composed and conducted the score. It was a stable hit he desperately needed.
But immediately afterward, he doubled down on his artistic impulse, shooting Rumblefish simultaneously, almost as a palate cleanser for the soul.
Rumblefish, 1983, was Coppola indulging in pure cinematic art. He shot it in stark black and white as an homage to German expressionism. It focused on two brothers, one a revered former gang leader, and the other trying to live up to his older brother's legend. It was critically acclaimed, highly stylized, and it bombed commercially.
Of course it did.
It earned just $2.5 million against a $10 million budget. And this is the duality of his career in microcosm. One commercially viable project immediately followed by a financially crippling passion project.
And the financial hemorrhaging continued with the Cotton Club.
Yes, the Cotton Club in 1984. This was another massive box office failure. It only grossed about $26 million, failing miserably to recoup the massive $48 million that had been privately invested in the production. The early 80s were essentially a decade-long financial emergency for him, requiring constant, frantic work just to stay afloat.
And amidst all this financial strain, the devastating personal tragedy of the decade occurred during the production of Gardens of Stone in 1987.
His eldest son, Giancarlo, died in a speedboating accident at the age of 22. The loss was immense, and the film itself, Gardens of Stone, was largely overshadowed by Coppola's personal grief, proving to be both a critical and commercial failure. The emotional and financial lows were intersecting so powerfully during this period.
The decade did finally provide one clear commercial respite, a small success to show he hadn't entirely lost his commercial touch.
That was Peggy Sue. Got married in 1986. It was a fun comedy starring Kathleen Turner, who received an Oscar nomination, and his nephew, Nicolas Cage. It was his first clear box office success since The Outsiders, and it offered a momentary reprieve from the relentless debt payments.
The decade closes with a whimper, though, with his segment in the anthology film New York Stories in 1989.
He directed Life Without Zoe, which he co-wrote with his daughter Sophia. This segment was generally panned by critics, sometimes described as the portion that actively reduced the overall quality of the anthology. A critic from the Washington Post even called it a mystifying embarrassment. This whole cycle, from great success to immense debt, to artistic experiment to critical lambasting, it all came to a head when Zoetrope Studios officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 1990.
So he exits the 1980s financially ruined, but he survived by sheer volume of work. He directed 7 films in one decade, almost none of which were his true passion projects, just work for hire to settle the books.
And the first act of the 1990s was a direct consequence of that bankruptcy. When Zoetrope filed for Chapter 11 in 1990, the compulsion to make The Godfather Part 3 was entirely financial. He admitted it. He was compelled to do it because of the dire financial situation caused by the monumental failure of One from the Heart.
He always seemed to resent that obligation, even down to the title of the film.
He absolutely preferred the title The Death of Michael Corleone. But Paramount rejected it because they prioritized brand recognition over artistic finality. And while it didn't achieve the critical heights of the first two, and it faced significant criticism, particularly regarding the casting of his daughter, Sophia, in the key role of Mary Corleone, it was precisely the lifeline he needed.
It was a hit.
This is a solid commercial success. It earned $136 million against a $54 million budget, and it earned 7 Academy Award nominations, including Best Director and Best Picture, which confirmed its status as a worthy, if imperfect, coda.
And decades later, he returned to that original vision, seeking vindication for it.
Yes. For the film's 30th anniversary in 2020, he released a new cut titled Mario Puzo's The Godfather, Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone. And Coppola emphatically stated that this new version vindicates the film's place among the trilogy and, significantly, vindicates his daughter Sophia's performance by reordering scenes and clarifying character motivations. It shows his enduring need not just to fix a film, but to reclaim control over the narrative surrounding it.
That need for vindication carried him into another massive commercial hit, showing his unparalleled visual mastery in the horror genre, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Dracula in 1992 was a visual feast and a massive worldwide smash. It grossed $215 million against a $40 million budget. It was the 9th highest grossing film globally that year. It proved he could pivot genres successfully again, and it won 3 Oscars for costume design, makeup, and sound editing.
But the genre jumps weren't universally successful, which leads us to one of his most controversial projects, Jack.
Jack, 1996, starring Robin Williams, was critically panned. The film, about a boy whose cells age 4 times faster than normal, suffered from a jarring contrast between broad comedy and tragic melodrama. It also failed commercially. Yet, Coppola defended it.
What was his defense?
He argued his motivation was simply wanting to work with his friend Robin Williams, who had insisted Coppola direct the film if he was going to star in it. For Coppola, even work for hire had to be personal.
He wrapped up the decade with a final, critically acclaimed film before his major shift, The Rainmaker.
The Rainmaker, 1997, a legal drama based on the John Grisham novel, was highly praised. Grisham himself called it the best adaptation of any of my books. And Roger Ebert specifically praised Coppola for keeping the focus on the little people in the story, showcasing his ability to handle commercial material with deep character grounding.
But after The Rainmaker, his relationship with the mainstream film industry dramatically shifted. He wasn't just directing less, he stopped being a professional director entirely.
This is a crucial turning point. Coppola stated he preferred to act more like a student. He chose to self-finance very small, low-budget movies, purely to experiment with the form and learn what making movies really was, without the immense pressure of commercial success or studio interference.
What was the primary reason for this drastic step away from the mainstream factory system?
He felt the commercial film industry had fundamentally changed. He said it had gone into the superhero business, a system dominated by pre-existing intellectual property and massive budgets aimed at franchising. And he was simply no longer interested enough to put in the extraordinary effort a film takes in that environment. This led to his highly experimental, self-financed films like Youth Without Youth, Tetro, and Twixt.
This era, post-2000, is also defined by his intense desire to literally rewrite his own history through relentless recutting and restoration of his back catalog.
This is the ultimate pursuit of creative control and vindication. He wasn't just fixing technical flaws. He was retroactively fighting the studio system and the commercial pressures that initially compromised his vision. He released Apocalypse Now Redux in 2001, restoring 49 minutes, including the famous French plantation scene. And then later he released the final cut in 2019, removing 20 minutes from Redux and restoring the film from the original negative.
And the story of the Cotton Club Encore restoration perfectly encapsulates this need for absolute personal vindication, regardless of the cost.
It's a remarkable anecdote. He found an old Betamax tape of his original cut and was so determined to restore his vision that he personally spent $500,000 of his own money to restore it. To create the Cotton Club Encore in 2019, he had to overcome immense technical hurdles, music rights issues, and the fact that MGM had zero interest in the project. He essentially financed the correction of a financial flop from the 80s purely to satisfy his artistic integrity.
And he even went back to his very first feature.
That's right. Even Dementia 13, that 9-day wonder from 1963, was restored in 2021. And it was restored specifically to remove footage that producer Roger Corman had added years earlier to try and make it more commercial. This shows that his battle for control spans his entire career, from the cheapest horror movie to the biggest war epic.
And all of that self-financing and personal capital leads us to his ultimate current project, Megalopolis. This is the ultimate manifestation of his financial independence.
Megalopolis is a passion project he has nurtured for decades. He even paused it after the 9/11 attacks, because the story about the aftermath and reconstruction of New York City after a mega disaster was deemed too sensitive. Now, it is entirely self-financed, reportedly costing him over $100 million of his own money.
That's incredible.
It's described as an epic on a grand scale, starring Adam Driver, Forrest Whitaker, Aubrey Plaza, and various members of the Coppola family. It premiered in competition at the 77th Cannes Film Festival.
The fact that a single director can bypass the entire studio system and write a 9-figure check for his own highly experimental epic speaks to an unprecedented degree of financial independence. And the mechanism that enables this final stage of his career is the massive commercial empire he built completely outside of Hollywood.
What's so fascinating here is how the Coppola name evolved from a signature of cinematic genius into a highly lucrative lifestyle brand. A brand capable of generating the kind of capital necessary to bypass the very studio gates he once fought to tear down.
Let's start with the dynasty itself. The Coppola family is arguably the closest America has to a multi-generational, Oscar-winning artistic dynasty.
The artistic lineage is astonishingly rich. His wife, Eleanor Neal, was a crucial creative partner, a writer and documentary filmmaker who co-directed Hearts of Darkness, A Filmmaker's Apocalypse, a film documenting the very agony of Apocalypse Now, and she was with him until her death in 2024.
And the next generation is even more prolific.
Their children are all deep in the industry. Roman is a screenwriter and director. Sophia is a celebrated director who won an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay in 2003 for Lost in Translation. And his late son, Giancarlo, was also a filmmaker, whose daughter, Gia Coppola, continues the tradition as a director.
Then you have the nephews.
Well, his sister, Talia Shire, was an actress nominated for an Oscar for The Godfather Part 2. And his famous nephews include the actors Nicolas Cage, who changed his name to distance himself from the family initially, and Jason Schwartzman, as well as Robert Schwartzman, an actor and musician. The deep roots of talent and collaboration run through that entire extended family.
The umbrella organization for this artistic output remains American Zoetrope, which has evolved greatly from that initial San Francisco warehouse.
It has. Zoetrope, founded in 1969, was the seed of that deviant studio. Today, it runs the Zoetrope Virtual Studio, which is essentially an online creative hub for members, bringing together departments for writers, directors, and producers, and supporting other creative endeavors like their short story vending machine project.
But Zoetrope's history is also riddled with high-stakes legal battles, showing that Coppola never stopped fighting the establishment, even in court.
That's why the legal disputes are so important for you, the learner. They highlight his persistent struggle against the system's contractual norms. There were two intense, highly public disputes with Warner Bros. The first involved the Pinocchio project. Coppola sued Warner Bros. In the late 1990s, alleging they sabotaged his intended version after a compensation disagreement led him to approach Columbia Pictures instead.
What was the result of that initial litigation?
An incredible initial victory. A jury initially awarded him $20 million, and a week later, an additional $60 million in punitive damages. An astonishing $80 million in total. It was seen as a major blow against studio power. However, the victory was short-lived.
It was later overturned, wasn't it?
Yes. The judge reversed the $60 million punitive damages award, and after subsequent appeals by both sides, the California Court of Appeals eventually ruled against Coppola on both counts in 2001. It effectively ended the litigation with a loss. It shows that even when he seemingly wins, The fight against the establishment is never truly over.
And the second major dispute involved the late Carl Sagan. That's an incredible intersection of science and cinema history.
It is. Coppola filed a lawsuit against Carl Sagan and Warner Bros. In 1996, claiming that Sagan's novel Contact, later made into a major film, was based on a story the pair had developed back in 1975 for a TV special idea called First Contact. The core of the claim was a development agreement that stipulated Coppola and Sagan would split proceeds from any novel Sagan wrote based on that concept.
That seems like a clear-cut contractual issue. What
Wow.
happened?
The case was dismissed in 1998, primarily because the court ruled that Coppola had waited too long to file suit, essentially arguing he slept on his rights. These constant legal skirmishes underscore his willingness to spend immense time and resources challenging every perceived contractual slight or sabotage by the major studios.
So, if the Zoetrope lawsuits often ended in losses, where is the real financial power coming from? It's the land, the grapes, and the lifestyle brand.
The Francis Ford Coppola Presents lifestyle brand is the financial anchor. It markets everything from films, videos, resorts, cafes, and a literary magazine called Zoetrope, all story. Crucially, he sells pasta sauces under the name Mamarella Foods, but the winemaking venture is the foundation.
That winemaking began in Napa Valley using the proceeds from The Godfather, the direct link between his biggest artistic success and his enduring commercial power.
A literal investment of artistic triumph into tangible assets. He started in 1975, initially producing wine under the Ford Coppola label. In 1995, he purchased the historic Inglenook Winery Chateau, one of Napa's most iconic properties. And here's a fascinating detail for you. In 2011, he acquired the historic Inglenook trademark. He famously stated he paid more for the trademark, the name itself, the heritage, than he did for the entire estate property.
That tells you everything about his valuation system. The history, the authenticity, and the brand identity are worth more than the physical assets.
Exactly. The Inglenook grapes today are organically grown, adhering to a high standard of quality. He also had the massive, family-friendly Francis Ford Coppola winery between Healdsburg and Geyserville. This facility was built with a specific vision, influenced by the idea of the Tivoli Gardens in Copenhagen, complete with swimming pools, boss courts, and a restaurant named Rustic.
And that winery essentially became a museum of his career, right?
It was a treasure trove for fans. It displayed several of his Oscars and movie memorabilia, including Vito Corleone's desk from The Godfather, and a restored 1948 Tucker sedan from his film Tucker, The Man in His Dream. He successfully leveraged his celebrity into a massive tourism and commercial enterprise, which he then sold in 2021 to Delicato Family Wines, giving him immense liquidity. He also owns Domaine de Brulé in Oregon.
Beyond the grapes, he is heavily invested in global hospitality, using the Coppola name for luxury resorts.
Under his company Coppola's Hideaway, he owns resorts globally: Plancano Lodge and the Turtle Inn in Belize, La Lancha in Guatemala, Jardín Escondido in Argentina, and the beautiful Palazzo Margherita in Bernalda, Italy, the ancestral home of his paternal grandparents. He is selling a lifestyle, one imbued with history and cinema.
And we can't forget the San Francisco roots, where it all began with Zoetrope.
He still owns Cafe Zoetrope in the Sentinel Building in San Francisco, which served traditional Italian cuisine and wine from his vineyards. And for 14 years, he co-owned the Rubicon restaurant with his friends Robin Williams and Robert De Niro, which closed in 2008.
Finally, in a nod to modern diversification, he even entered a completely new market: cannabis.
In 2018, he launched a cannabis brand called the Growers Series. It was packaged in a mock black tin wine bottle resembling his wine brand, offering 3 strains: a sativa, indica, and hybrid. This entire diverse commercial structure, from resorts to pasta sauces to cannabis, is the highly effective non-studio financial engine that funds his student director experimental film projects like the $100 million Megalopolis.
What's fascinating here is the sheer audacity of Francis Ford Coppola's overall career model. He took the initial necessary mainstream success of films like The Godfather and immediately used those funds not to bankroll more Hollywood films, but to acquire land and start his independent, diversified commercial ventures.
Exactly. He uses the secure, steady profits from wine, resorts, and his lifestyle brand to fuel highly personal, sometimes eccentric, often financially risky independent film experiments. He is the very definition of a director who constantly questions assumptions about how films should be made and, most importantly, how they should be financed. He's maintained a fiercely independent stance against the studio factory system that initially tried to fire him.
The scale of his success and his failure is truly epic. Think about that journey. From being bedridden with polio, forced to dream up puppet shows, hustling by writing nudie cuties for $10 a week, only to launch himself into one of the most creatively potent decades in film history, and then to lose his massive studio because of a single financial flop. He survived immense debt, intense legal battles, and profound personal tragedy, only to rise again as his own private financier, proving that when his vision is at stake, he will find the money no matter where it comes from.
And this raises an important question, especially now that he has self-funded his $120 million passion project, Megalopolis, a film he literally could not make without his commercial empire. His friend, George Lucas, once introduced him by saying, "What Francis does creatively is jump off cliffs." Considering he used Godfather money to buy land and has now used his winery and commercial empire profits to fully fund his latest massive epic, this raises an important question for you, the learner. When you're Francis Ford Coppola, owning the land, the means of production, and the distribution, what, if anything, is still a cliff jump?